A son so beautiful that the entire nation stopped to stare at him. So patient that he waited 7 full years for his revenge. So cunning that he stole an entire kingdom from his own father. And in the end, he died hanging from a tree, betrayed by the very beauty that made him famous. This is the story of Absalom, and it begins with a curse. Long ago, the prophet Nathan stood before King David and spoke words that would haunt his bloodline forever. Violence will never leave your house. No one could have imagined that this violence would wear the face of the most stunning man Israel had ever seen. Pay close attention, because this is far more than a simple story about a son turning against his father. This is prophecy brought to life, where every loving gesture hides treachery underneath, where every throne that is taken by force must eventually be paid for in blood, where physical perfection itself transforms into a weapon of destruction. Observe as the strands of destiny pull ever tighter, a young woman violated and screaming for fairness that will never arrive, a ruler and father frozen by the weight of his own sinful history, and a radiant prince whose hunger for power blazes brighter than the midday sun hanging over the holy city. The punishment from heaven approaches like a tempest building along the distant skyline, unhurried yet unstoppable and full of terror, and when it finally arrives, even the woodland trees will serve as instruments of death. Out of all the sons that King David fathered within the royal residence of Jerusalem, a single one distinguished himself above everyone else. This son bore the name Absalom, and he was the 3rd child David had, brought into the world by Maacah, who was herself the daughter of Talmai, the ruler of Geshur. This heritage meant that Absalom carried the blood of kings flowing through him from both his father and his mother, making her a princess through 2 different royal lines. However, what truly made Absalom different from his siblings, and indeed from every other man walking the land of Israel, was his breathtaking physical appearance. The holy writings found in the 2nd book of Samuel, in the 14th chapter at the 25th verse, reveal to us that throughout the entire nation of Israel, no person received as much admiration for their physical beauty as Absalom did. Starting from the bottom of his feet all the way up to the top of his head, not a single imperfection could be found on him. From the lowest point to the highest, this man was without fault. Not one defect existed anywhere on his body. His facial features were attractive beyond what words could capture. His physical frame was powerful and striking, and common people all across the realm constantly discussed how magnificent he looked. Yet something even more extraordinary than his flawless appearance was the hair that grew from Absalom's head. The 2nd book of Samuel, in its 14th chapter at the 26th verse, explains how whenever he trimmed the hair on his head, which happened at the conclusion of each year, he would have it cut. Whenever the weight became too much for him to carry, he would trim it off. When he placed his hair on a scale, it measured 200 shekels, according to the official royal standard. His hair grew with such incredible thickness and length that once every year, when the burden of carrying it became unbearable, he would have it removed, and when measured, it came to approximately 5 pounds in weight. Picture in your mind this royal prince strolling down the streets of Jerusalem, his spectacular hair cascading behind him, his perfect features causing every person to turn and look. Absalom understood exactly what effect his presence had on those around him. He moved through the world with the self-assurance of someone who had never heard the word no, never experienced rejection, never been passed over or ignored. Inside the royal palace, standing among his numerous brothers and sisters, he was impossible to miss. David had fathered many sons through his various wives, yet Absalom possessed a quality that set him apart, a captivating energy that caused people to freeze in their tracks and gaze upon him. He was looked up to, praised openly, and preferred by countless individuals who believed he was the obvious choice to eventually occupy his father's seat of power. Absalom had a sister whose name was Tamar, and she shared the same mother as him. Her beauty matched her brother's handsomeness perfectly, and she remained pure and untouched, exactly as was expected for a daughter of the king who had not yet been given in marriage. But Tamar also had a different half-brother called Amnon, who happened to be the very first son David ever fathered, which made him the one set to inherit the kingdom. What happens next will change everything, and it starts with an obsession that disgusted even the man who felt it. The second book of Samuel, in its 13th chapter at the first verse, reveals that Amnon, the son born to David, developed feelings for her. But these feelings were not genuine affection. This was an unhealthy fixation, a twisted craving that ate away at Amnon until his physical health deteriorated from longing for something that was forbidden to him. A companion of his named Jonadab, who the third verse describes as an extremely cunning individual, observed the change in Amnon's condition and questioned why the son of the king appeared so worn down and exhausted with each passing morning. Amnon admitted his secret, saying that he had developed feelings for Tamar, the sister of his brother Absalom. Jonadab came up with a sinister scheme. He instructed Amnon to act as though illness had overtaken him, and when David arrived to see how he was doing, to ask that Tamar be sent to cook a meal where he could watch so that he could receive food directly from her hands. Amnon carried out this wicked guidance exactly as told. When David came to visit his son, Amnon made his appeal, and the king, having no reason to suspect anything wrong, dispatched a message to Tamar telling her to travel to her brother Amnon's residence and make a meal for him. Tamar followed what her father instructed. She traveled to where Amnon was staying and started preparing bread while he observed everything from where he lay resting. The second book of Samuel, in its 13th chapter at verses 8 and 9, describes how she gathered flour and worked it with her hands and shaped it into small cakes while he watched, then baked what she had made, and afterward she placed the cooking vessel in front of him and poured out the food, yet he would not consume any of it. At that moment, Amnon issued a command that exposed what he truly wanted. He demanded that every other person exit the room immediately. Once no one else remained, and they were completely alone, verse 11 tells us that he grabbed hold of her and spoke these words, "Come and share my bed, my sister." Tamar was filled with horror at what she heard. She responded to him in verse 12, saying, "No, my brother, you must not force yourself upon me, because such actions are never committed in Israel. You must not carry out this terrible deed." She pleaded with him desperately to reconsider, attempting to make him see reason. She even proposed in verse 13 that he approach the king directly, suggesting that David would not refuse to give her to him in marriage, anything to stop the terrible thing that was about to take place. But Amnon refused to hear her words. Verse 14 captures the horrifying moment in time, stating that he paid no attention to her pleas, and because his physical strength exceeded hers, he overpowered her completely and forced himself upon her. In that single instant, everything about Tamar's existence was shattered. Her prospects for the future, her reputation, her sense of self-worth, everything was ripped away by a man who shared her father's blood. Then something even more disturbing occurred afterward. Verse 15 states that Amnon then developed an intense hatred toward her, and this hatred that filled him exceeded by far the supposed affection he had claimed to feel before. The obsessive desire that had previously made him physically unwell now transformed into complete revulsion. He summoned his personal attendant and spoke the words recorded in verse 17, commanding him to remove this woman from his sight immediately and secure the door behind her once she was gone. Tamar departed from Amnon's dwelling while still wearing the elaborate gown with long sleeves that identified her as a virgin daughter of royalty, a garment she would never have the right to wear again. The second book of Samuel, in its 13th chapter at the 19th verse, tells us that Tamar scattered ashes over her head and ripped apart the elegant robe she had been wearing, and she placed her hand upon her head and walked away, weeping loudly with every step she took. She made her way through the palace grounds in complete public disgrace, her loud cries of anguish informing everyone within earshot of the horrible thing that had been done to her. Absalom discovered his sister in this completely broken condition. The scriptures found in the second book of Samuel at the 13th chapter and 20th verse preserve the very first words he spoke to her, asking if Amnon, her brother, had been alone with her. He already understood the truth before any answer came from her lips. The garment torn to pieces, the ashes covering her, the tears streaming down her face, every detail communicated what had happened. The way Absalom responded was measured and controlled, yet his words carried deep significance beneath the surface. He spoke to Tamar, telling her to remain silent about this matter for now. "My sister, he is your brother. Do not allow this matter to consume your heart completely." Some people might listen to these words and believe that Absalom was brushing aside his sister's suffering, but such an interpretation would be entirely mistaken. He was instructing her to keep quiet for the present moment, not for the rest of her life. He was urging her not to permit this tragedy to utterly break her spirit because he was already forming intentions of his own. The statement about Amnon being her brother was never meant to serve as justification for the crime that had been committed. It was Absalom's way of recognizing how complicated the situation ahead would become. This was not simply some random attacker who had harmed her. This was the firstborn child of the king himself, the man next in line for the royal seat, their own flesh and blood through their shared father. Whatever action was taken would send shockwaves through the entire royal family. The verse goes on to say that Tamar remained and lived as a woman without hope in the household of her brother Absalom. He welcomed her into his home, provided her with a safe place to stay, and kept her under his protection. But that single word describing her as desolate reveals everything we need to understand about Tamar's state of being. In the judgment of society, she was destroyed, impossible to give in marriage, utterly shattered, and with every single day that Absalom looked upon his sister existing in this miserable condition, his fury intensified. The second book of Samuel, in its 13th chapter at the 22nd verse, provides us with an essential glimpse into who Absalom truly was as a person. But Absalom never spoke a single word to Amnon, whether friendly or hostile, because Absalom harbored deep hatred toward Amnon for having forced himself upon his sister Tamar. Take careful notice of what the passage does not include. It never mentions that Absalom faced Amnon directly about what he had done. It never says that he raised his voice or made threats or caused any kind of public disturbance. What it tells us instead is that Absalom spoke to Amnon neither positively nor negatively. He uttered not a single syllable to him. This complete absence of words carried far more danger than any verbal threat ever could. Absalom was not someone who acted on sudden bursts of emotion. His nature was cool and detached, always thinking ahead, incredibly patient. While other men might have erupted with fury and gone looking for immediate payback, Absalom kept himself entirely under control. He observed Amnon walking around the palace without any restrictions. He witnessed his half-brother sharing meals and enjoying laughter and resting peacefully through the night, never once facing punishment for his terrible deed. And as each new day arrived, the hatred burning inside Absalom grew even more intense, constantly fed by the ongoing misery of his sister and the complete lack of action from his father. The stunning prince with the flawless physical form was teaching himself how to put on a false face. On the surface that others could see, he kept his calm demeanor and his dignified bearing as royalty. But deep within himself, a scheme was taking shape. a scheme that would demand great patience, perfect timing, and just the right moment to strike. Absalom had no problem waiting because he recognized that vengeance delivered when emotions had cooled proved far more effective than actions taken in the heat of rage. He would provide Amnon with no advance notice, no opportunity to get ready or to mount any kind of defense. When the right moment finally presented itself, the action would be quick and it would be permanent. When word of what had been done to Tamar made its way to King David, his response should have been swift and harsh. The second book of Samuel, in its 13th chapter at the 21st verse, simply states that when King David learned about everything that had occurred, he became extremely furious. The original Hebrew term employed in this passage communicates a burning rage, a fierce and intense anger. David was filled with fury over what his eldest son had committed, but that is exactly where the passage concludes. David experienced anger, and following that, he took no action whatsoever. No form of punishment was ever decreed. No measure of justice was ever delivered. No repercussion of any kind ever reached Amnon for the violation of his own sister. The man positioned to inherit the throne of Israel had carried out an atrocious act, and the king, whose duty it was to uphold the laws handed down by God, kept his mouth shut and did nothing. Why? Why would a king, whose duty was to enforce God's law, stay silent? Think about this for a moment. What would you have done? Your daughter violated. Your firstborn son, the attacker. The law demands death, but this is your heir, your legacy. The sacred writings do not reveal exactly what David was thinking, but we can piece together understanding from the things we already know about his history. David himself had taken another man's wife to his bed when he slept with Bathsheba, and he had arranged for her husband Uriah to be killed. The prophet named Nathan had stood before him and accused him directly, and God had extended forgiveness to David. Yet the prophet had also pronounced that violence would be a permanent presence in David's household as a direct result of his sinful actions. It is possible that David believed he possessed no moral standing to pass judgment on his son after having committed offenses that were even more severe. Perhaps the weight of his own guilt left him unable to move forward. Or perhaps the explanation was much more straightforward than any of that. Amnon was the very first son David had ever fathered, his designated successor, the child who was meant to take over the kingdom after him. To impose a severe penalty upon Amnon, to have him put to death as the law required for such a violation, would mean sacrificing the one who was supposed to continue his legacy. David held deep affection for his sons, even when their actions were wicked. This love of his created weakness in moments that called for strength. But by failing to act, David communicated a powerful message that spread throughout every corner of the royal household. It informed everyone that if you happened to be someone the king especially favored, if your status was high enough, if David's affection for you ran deep enough, you could escape any consequence. Even the most appalling wrongdoing could go without any punishment at all. It communicated to Tamar that what she had endured mattered less than preserving the position that Amnon held. It communicated to every other son that the justice their father administered was not impartial, that certain people received preferential treatment. And it communicated to Absalom that if he desired any kind of justice for what had been done to his sister, securing it would fall entirely on his own shoulders. The silence that David maintained was not merely a failure to respond, it was an active choice that set every subsequent event into motion. Every single day that went by without Amnon experiencing any consequences was another day when the kingdom's respect for David's leadership weakened further. Every day was another day when Absalom's disdain for his father intensified. The same king who had brought down the giant Goliath, who had crushed the armies of the Philistines, who had built and secured the throne of Israel. This very same king found himself unable to take disciplinary action against his own child. Through Absalom's eyes, his father had ceased to be the legendary and powerful ruler of stories told around fires. He had become a feeble, aging man who permitted his feelings to dictate his choices, who showed favoritism to certain children, who could not bring himself to enforce the very laws he had a sacred duty to maintain. This newfound understanding transformed something essential in how Absalom perceived both his father and the throne that his father occupied. Absalom did not rush to take any immediate action. The second book of Samuel, at chapter 13 and verse 23, begins with these specific words, stating that after a period of 2 complete years had passed, Absalom arranged for sheep shearers to work at a place called Baal Hazor, situated in the region close to Ephraim. 2 full years. Let that sink in. 730 days of silence, of watching, of waiting, of seeing Amnon laugh and eat and sleep peacefully while Tamar withered away in Absalom's house. Most men would have exploded within days. Absalom waited 730 of them. For a span of 24 months, Absalom continued his practice of saying nothing at all whenever he was near Amnon. For 2 entire years, he kept his eyes open, he bided his time, and he refined his scheme. This level of patience was truly extraordinary. The majority of men would have lashed out while their anger still burned hot, striking back within mere days or perhaps weeks following such a crime. But Absalom was different. He grasped the concept that allowing time to pass actually worked in his favor. The more time that elapsed, the more Amnon would let down his defenses, the more everyone around them would come to believe that maybe Absalom had come to terms with everything that happened, that maybe he had put it behind him and was moving forward with his life. 2 years represented enough time for people to stop being on alert, to neglect their watchfulness, to convince themselves that whatever threat once existed had now disappeared. When Absalom eventually decided to act, his selection of the moment was absolutely perfect. The time of year when sheep were sheared was a period of festivities throughout ancient Israel, bearing similarities to celebrations held during harvest season. It marked a time when the hard work was completed and communities came together to share food, drink wine, and celebrate the rewards that their efforts had produced. Absalom extended an invitation to every single one of the king's sons, asking them to join him at Baal Hazor for this festive occasion. Looking at the surface, it appeared to be an offering of reconciliation, a display of family togetherness, an indication that Absalom wished to gather all the royal brothers for a time of fellowship and bonding, but Absalom carried an additional request in his heart. Verse 24 records the moment when Absalom approached the king and spoke these words, saying, "Look, your servant has arranged for the shearing of sheep. Please allow the king along with all his attendants to accompany your servant to this gathering." He extended the invitation directly to David himself. This move demonstrated great cunning for a pair of reasons. To begin with, it caused the entire invitation to appear completely harmless. If he was asking the king himself to attend, certainly no malicious intent could be behind it. Beyond that, Absalom almost certainly anticipated that his father would turn down the offer. And indeed, David did refuse to come. Verse 25 preserves his answer, where the king spoke to Absalom, saying, "No, my son, it would not be wise for all of us to attend, because we would place too great a burden upon you." David recognized that having the king travel with his complete royal party would create enormous expense that Absalom would have to bear. He urged Absalom to accept this decision, but Absalom continued to push for more. Then came the request that Absalom had truly wanted to make all along, found in verse 26. Absalom then asked, "If you yourself will not come, then at least permit my brother Amnon to attend with us." This was the actual purpose behind everything Absalom had been working toward, getting Amnon specifically to come. The way David responded reveals much about his instincts. The king questioned him directly, asking why Amnon in particular should accompany him. Even David could feel that something about this particular request was not quite right. Yet Absalom continued to insist and apply pressure. And ultimately, verse 27 tells us that David agreed and sent Amnon along with him, together with all the rest of the king's sons. At last, Absalom possessed exactly what he required. Amnon would be far from the city of Jerusalem, removed from the soldiers who guarded the palace, beyond the reach of his father's protective presence. He would be present at the celebration that Absalom was hosting, completely surrounded by servants loyal to Absalom, consuming wine that Absalom provided, and Absalom had previously delivered specific instructions to his servants, which are preserved in verse 28. Absalom issued this command to his servants, telling them to watch carefully for the moment when Amnon becomes cheerful from drinking wine. And when I give you the signal to strike Amnon, you must kill him at that moment. Do not let fear hold you back. Have I not personally given you this command? Show courage and demonstrate your valor. Every detail of the scheme was now in place. Absalom intended to hold back until Amnon had consumed enough wine to become intoxicated. His ability to react quickly would be diminished. His capacity to think clearly would be compromised. Then the instant Absalom gave his signal, his servants would carry out the attack. Absalom provided them with assurance that no blame would fall upon them. He was accepting complete responsibility through his direct order. He was issuing this command in his capacity as their prince and master, and he urged them to demonstrate bravery and strength, employing words that resembled orders given before military engagements, framing this planned killing as though it were a battle that needed to be won. Everything was in place. The trap was set, and Amnon was walking straight into it. The celebration at Baal Hazor commenced just like any other festive gathering. Wine was poured generously without limit, food was served in great abundance, and all of the king's sons allowed themselves to unwind and enjoy the festivities around them. Amnon, the man positioned to inherit the throne, had no cause to think danger might be near. A full 2 years had come and gone since the attack on Tamar. If Absalom had harbored intentions of seeking revenge, surely he would have acted upon them long before now. Amnon drank heavily and freely, his defenses lowered completely. Then, precisely as Absalom had designed things to unfold, at the moment when wine had made Amnon's heart glad and carefree, the time for action arrived. The second book of Samuel at chapter 13 and verse 29 describes the events that followed. The servants belonging to Absalom carried out against Amnon exactly what Absalom had instructed them to do. At the signal from Absalom, his servants cut down Amnon, and in that instant, the firstborn son of King David, the man designated to inherit the throne of Israel, was slain during a feast by men serving his own brother. The verse proceeds to describe what happened immediately afterward. Every one of the king's sons jumped to their feet, and each one climbed onto his mule and escaped as quickly as possible. Complete panic spread among the princes. If Absalom had taken the life of Amnon, would they be targeted next? Was this the start of a complete slaughter of the royal family? None of them stayed long enough to discover the answer. Every brother seized his mule, which served as the standard means of travel for members of royalty during that era, and raced off in various directions, all of them rushing back toward Jerusalem and the safety it offered. While this was happening, a messenger arrived before David carrying news that would devastate him. But the information this messenger brought was incorrect. Verse 30 explains that while the princes were still traveling on their way back, a report reached David claiming that Absalom had killed every single one of the king's sons and that not a single one of them had survived. Someone had witnessed the chaotic scene, had observed princes scattering and fleeing in every direction, and had drawn the worst possible conclusion. This person had hurried ahead to inform the king that every one of his sons had been killed. The following verse captures how David responded when he heard this devastating report. The king rose from where he sat and ripped his clothing apart and collapsed onto the ground, and every servant who stood nearby in his presence also tore their garments. David literally dropped to the earth in his overwhelming grief. He tore apart his royal garments, which was the sign of the most profound sorrow possible. Those who served him followed his example, joining together with their king in his tremendous anguish. For a brief time, David was convinced that he had lost every single one of his sons in the course of a single day. But then Jonadab stepped forward to speak, the very same Jonadab who had assisted Amnon in creating the scheme to assault Tamar in the first place. Verse 32 contains the words he spoke, urging his lord not to believe that all of the young men, all of the king's sons, had been killed, explaining that only Amnon had actually died. He continued by saying that this outcome had been decided upon by Absalom's command ever since the day when Amnon violated his sister Tamar. Jonadab made it known that he had been aware the entire time that Absalom was planning to take revenge. He gave David reassurance that the only one who had died was Amnon. Verse 34 provides confirmation of this, stating that Absalom had escaped, and the young man assigned to keep watch from a high point raised his eyes and looked into the distance, and there he could see a large group of people approaching along the road behind him, traveling beside the mountain slope. The watchman was able to observe the other princes making their way toward Jerusalem, all of them alive and unharmed, and verse 37 reveals what became of Absalom, explaining that Absalom had fled and traveled to stay with Talmai, who was the son of Ammihud and the king of Geshur. And David continued mourning for his son as one day followed another. Absalom had escaped to the kingdom ruled by his grandfather, to the land where his mother's father held power, understanding that he would receive shelter and protection in that place. Remaining within Israel was impossible after taking the life of the king's firstborn child. But pay attention to those final words, describing how David mourned for his son. Which son was he grieving for? The passage leaves this deliberately unclear. Was David's mourning directed toward Amnon, whose life had ended? Or was his grief focused on Absalom, who had now become a fugitive running from justice? Perhaps his sorrow encompassed both of them. David had suffered the loss of 2 sons on that day, one taken by death, the other driven away into exile. The second book of Samuel at chapter 13 and verse 38 reveals what occurred in the time that followed, stating that Absalom fled and made his way to Geshur, where he remained for a period of 3 years. For 3 complete years, Absalom lived away from Jerusalem, separated from the land of Israel, making his home in the kingdom his grandfather ruled. He had obtained vengeance for what had been done to his sister, but the price he paid was banishment from everything familiar to him, from the place he had always called home, from his father, from any future he might have claimed. Throughout these 3 years, something significant was taking place within David's heart and mind. Verse 39 exposes this inner transformation, explaining that the spirit of the king yearned to go out to Absalom, because his grief over Amnon had found some comfort now that time had passed since his death. As the months and years went by and the sharp pain of losing Amnon gradually softened, David found his thoughts turning more and more toward the son who still lived. David began experiencing a deep longing for Absalom, wishing desperately that he could lay eyes on him once more, desiring above all else to restore their relationship. Yet David took no action based on these feelings that stirred within him. He made no effort whatsoever to arrange for Absalom's return. He dispatched no messengers to Geshur. He issued no official pardon for the killing. He sent no invitation asking his son to come back home. David ached for his son with all his being, but he remained frozen and unable to act because of his own conflicted emotions, and possibly because of his internal struggle over what justice demanded. Amnon had forced himself upon Tamar and faced no punishment for it. Absalom had ended Amnon's life as an act of retribution. How could the king simply overlook and forgive such an act? Yet how could any father persist in pushing away his own child when every fiber of his heart cried out for him? And so David remained motionless, taking no action at all, and Absalom continued living in Geshur, fully aware that his father longed for his presence, yet absolutely certain that no summons would ever come. And honestly, can you blame him for what he was becoming? His sister had been destroyed. His father had done nothing for 2 years. Absalom had delivered the justice David refused to give. And now he was the one being punished. Every day in exile, the same question burned in his mind. Why does David mourn the rapist but abandon the avenger? We can only attempt to imagine what effect those 3 years of separation had on the way Absalom thought. He possessed abundant time to contemplate his father's consistent failure to take action when action was needed. David had neglected to impose any consequence on Amnon for a span of 2 years. Now David was neglecting to bring Absalom back for a span of 3 years. The king appeared utterly incapable of arriving at difficult decisions whenever his sons were involved. Absalom most likely spent much of his time in exile, reflecting upon every weakness his father possessed. The sins David had committed in the past involving Bathsheba and the death of Uriah were common knowledge throughout the land. His inability to properly discipline his children was becoming well known to everyone. His tendency to be ruled by his emotions left him open to being manipulated by others. These 3 years spent living in Geshur represented more than mere exile for Absalom. They marked a period of profound personal transformation. The prince who had departed from Jerusalem with the goal of obtaining justice for his violated sister was evolving into an entirely different person, someone whose heart had grown harder, someone whose ambitions now reached far beyond mere revenge for a wrong committed. Joab, who served as both David's nephew and his chief military commander, came to understand that the current state of affairs could not be allowed to persist without end. The second book of Samuel at chapter 14 and verse 1 states that Joab, who was the son of Zeruiah, recognized that the heart of the king was filled with longing for Absalom. Joab observed the yearning that David felt and made a decision to manipulate the king into finally taking action. The scheme that Joab devised was quite complex and elaborate. He sought out a clever woman who lived in the town of Tekoa and instructed her carefully to present herself as someone in mourning. He provided her with a story she would tell to the king, which was essentially a parable designed to make a point. The woman appeared before David and explained that she was a widow who had given birth to 2 sons. She told him that her sons had gotten into a fight out in a field where there was nobody present who could pull them apart, and during this struggle, one of them killed the other. Now, her entire extended family was insisting that she surrender her only remaining son so that he could be put to death as punishment for killing his brother. If she agreed to do this, she would be left with no sons at all, with no one remaining to continue her family line into future generations. The way David responded, which is preserved in verse 11, came without any hesitation. He swore by the living Lord that not even a single hair belonging to her son would fall to the ground. He made a solemn promise to ensure her remaining son would be kept safe from harm. Then the woman exposed the trap she had carefully laid, speaking the words found in verse 13. She asked David why he had devised such a plan against the people who belonged to God, because by rendering this judgment, the king was actually condemning himself, since he refused to bring back the son he had sent away from home. She was drawing attention to the glaring contradiction in David's position. He was prepared to extend mercy toward the son of a complete stranger who had committed murder, yet he would not show that same mercy to his very own child. David came to understand that he had been skillfully manipulated, and when he demanded to know who had convinced her to do this, she confessed in verse 19 that it was Joab, his servant, who had given her this command. It was Joab who had placed every single one of these carefully chosen words into the mouth of his servant. David sent for Joab, and at last issued the command that everyone had been hoping and waiting to hear. David declared that he had now granted this request. He instructed Joab to go and bring back the young man named Absalom. After 3 long years had passed, David was finally permitting his son to return to his homeland, but attached to this permission was a crushing condition. Verse 24 contains the complete instructions that David gave, where the king declared that Absalom must live separately in his own residence. He was forbidden from coming into the presence of the king, and so Absalom dwelt apart in his own residence and never came before the king's face. Absalom received permission to come back to the city of Jerusalem, but he was prohibited from looking upon his father's face. He had returned home, yet he was not truly home. He had been brought back, yet he was not genuinely restored. He could make his dwelling in the city where he had been born, walk along its streets, encounter its inhabitants, but entering the palace was forbidden to him. Speaking with his father was not allowed. True reconciliation remained beyond his reach. This incomplete restoration may have actually been more painful than remaining in exile, because every single day Absalom was forced to live with the constant reminder that David continued to refuse him. The second book of Samuel at chapter 14 and verse 28 reveals how long this agonizing situation continued. Absalom made his home in Jerusalem for 2 full years without ever being allowed into the presence of the king. 2 additional years were added to his suffering. First came 2 years of watching Amnon walk free without any consequences. Then came 3 years of living in exile far from home. Now came 2 more years of residing in Jerusalem while being forbidden from appearing before his father. 7 years in total comprised various forms of rejection and separation from his family. These 7 years had completely transformed who Absalom was as a person. The prince who had once desired nothing more than justice for his violated sister had now absorbed difficult lessons about how power operates, about the nature of weakness, about the true mechanics of how kingdoms function. He had discovered that David was susceptible to manipulation, that the king's emotional nature created vulnerabilities that could be exploited, that the system of justice in Israel was not impartial, but instead favored whoever happened to hold David's affection at any given moment. And perhaps the most significant realization of all was that Absalom had started viewing himself not merely as David's son desperately seeking acceptance, but as someone who might actually rule the kingdom more effectively than his father ever had. After spending 2 years living within Jerusalem without once being permitted to look upon his father's face, Absalom reached the limit of his patience. He needed to bring an end to this partial banishment, this incomplete punishment that left him dangling somewhere between being welcomed and being cast out. So Absalom resolved to create a situation that would force a meeting with David, but accomplishing this required assistance from someone with influence. The individual capable of arranging such a meeting was Joab, the very same commander who had orchestrated his return from Geshur in the first place. The second book of Samuel at chapter 14 and verse 29 describes the action Absalom took. Absalom dispatched a message requesting that Joab come to him so that he could be sent to speak with the king, but Joab refused to respond and did not come. He sent a second request, and still Joab would not come to meet with him. Absalom called for Joab on one occasion, and the commander completely disregarded his summons. He called for him a second time, and Joab continued to refuse to appear. Perhaps Joab was preoccupied with matters relating to the military. Perhaps he believed he had already contributed enough by securing Absalom's return to the city. Perhaps he could sense that becoming more deeply involved in this situation would put him at risk. Regardless of what motivated his silence, Joab simply would not answer when Absalom called for him. So Absalom selected a dramatic method to capture Joab's attention and force him to respond. Verse 30 preserves the order he gave to his servants. He told them to observe that the field belonging to Joab was located right next to his own property, and that barley was growing there. He commanded them to go out and set the entire field ablaze with fire. Following these instructions, the servants of Absalom ignited the field and watched it burn. Absalom had directed his men to destroy the barley field that Joab owned, which happened to be situated adjacent to land that belonged to Absalom himself. This was no minor action or small gesture. Barley represented significant value as a crop, and intentionally destroying the harvest of another person constituted a grave offense. But Absalom was confident that this approach would achieve its purpose. And he was correct in this assumption. Verse 31 tells us that Joab immediately got up and traveled to the house where Absalom lived, and confronted him with a question, demanding to know why his servants had burned down his field. Joab came rushing over at once, insisting on an explanation for why Absalom had destroyed his property. Now Absalom finally had the complete and undivided attention of the commander, and he spoke with total directness about the frustration that had been building inside him. Verse 32 provides us with the exact words Absalom spoke in response. Absalom gave his answer to Joab, explaining that he had sent word asking him to come so that he could dispatch Joab to the king with a question. That question was why Absalom had even bothered leaving Geshur at all. He declared that it would have been preferable for him to have remained there instead of coming back. Therefore, he demanded to be allowed into the presence of the king, and if any guilt remained attached to him, then let the king carry out his execution. The words Absalom spoke struck directly at the core of the entire problem. What possible purpose had been served by bringing him back from Geshur if he was still forbidden from seeing his own father? This state of being only partially restored was actually more painful than living in exile had been. At least while living in Geshur, Absalom had been able to maintain his dignity and self-respect. Here in the city of Jerusalem, he existed as a prince living under a cloud of shame, residing in his own dwelling, yet barred from the palace as though he were some common lawbreaker. Absalom instructed Joab to carry a message to the king, telling David that he must either grant complete and total restoration or else have Absalom put to death. This condition of being suspended between two states had become impossible to bear any longer. If David genuinely considered Absalom to be guilty and deserving of punishment, then he should follow through and administer justice properly. But if David had truly forgiven his son in his heart, then what justification existed for this ongoing separation between them? Joab traveled to where David was and communicated the message that Absalom had given him. The king, who had spent years longing desperately for his son, at last consented to meet with him. The second book of Samuel at chapter 14 and verse 33 describes the moment when father and son were finally reunited. Joab went before the king and told him everything, and then David sent a summons for Absalom to appear. He came before the king and lowered himself until his face touched the ground in the presence of the king, and the king placed a kiss upon Absalom. After 5 years of being kept apart from one another, 3 of those years spent in Geshur and 2 of them in Jerusalem, father and son finally stood looking at each other face to face. Absalom approached David and prostrated himself with his face pressed against the floor, which was the customary position demonstrating complete submission when appearing before royalty. This was the appropriate and expected manner for presenting oneself before a king, displaying proper respect and recognizing his authority. Absalom was not approaching as someone of equal standing, but rather as a subject of the realm, as a son who sought to receive his father's blessing, and David kissed him. Within the customs of ancient Middle Eastern culture, this kiss carried profound meaning and importance. It served as an indication of acceptance, of peaceful intentions, of a relationship that had been mended. When a father placed a kiss upon his son following a lengthy separation, the meaning was clear. It signified forgiveness. It signified that everything in the past could now be left behind them. It signified that they could move into the future as one united family. This kiss should have been enough to repair all the damage that had been done. But something had shattered between them that no kiss possessed the power to mend. 5 years represented an enormous span of time, far too much time. Throughout those years, far too many things had taken place. Tamar continued to exist as a woman without hope, still residing in the house of Absalom, still carrying the wounds from what Amnon had inflicted upon her, and from David's complete failure to bring any punishment upon the one who harmed her. Absalom had taken the life of his own brother, and then lived as an exile in a foreign land, only to return to a city where he was physically present, yet completely cut off from everyone. The kiss served as a symbol of reconciliation, but symbols alone cannot erase years filled with suffering and rejection. Throughout those 5 years of separation, Absalom had gained knowledge and insights that altered him permanently at his very core. He had come to understand that the love David offered came with strings attached, that the king showed preference to certain children over others, that the way justice operated in Israel was determined by your identity rather than by your actions. He had discovered that his father was vulnerable to being controlled and influenced, first by Jonadab, who had assisted Amnon in his wicked scheme, then by Joab, who had engineered Absalom's return to his homeland, and then by Absalom himself, who had compelled this face-to-face meeting by setting fire to the barley growing in Joab's field. The coming together of father and son followed all the proper forms, but contained nothing of substance. David placed a kiss upon Absalom, but the trust between them was not rebuilt. The affection they once shared was not rekindled. The bond between them remained fractured and unrepaired. Absalom stood up from receiving that kiss, still possessing his stunning physical beauty, still radiating that magnetic charm, still demonstrating that sharp intelligence, but transformed at his deepest level into someone entirely different. He had approached his father hoping to receive acceptance and approval. What he encountered instead was proof that David lacked strength, that the throne ruling over Israel was held by a man who allowed his feelings to dictate every choice he made. Following the formal mending of relations with David, Absalom gained the freedom to travel anywhere throughout Jerusalem without any limitations placed upon him. He was permitted to walk through the palace doors, take part in official royal events, and once again be viewed by the populace as a legitimate prince of the nation of Israel. But Absalom had no intention of simply resuming his former way of living. Instead, he started presenting himself to the public in an entirely fresh manner. The second book of Samuel, at chapter 15 and verse 1, reveals the steps Absalom took next. Following these events, Absalom obtained for himself a chariot along with horses and employed 50 men whose job was to run ahead of him wherever he went. This represented a striking break from the customs that had been established in Israel. David himself, even though he held the position of king, had maintained a comparatively modest way of living when measured against the rulers of the kingdoms surrounding Israel. He did not travel through the streets putting on elaborate exhibitions of his riches and his authority, But Absalom made a different choice entirely. He purchased a chariot for himself, a vehicle that people associated with royal status and military strength. Chariots required significant wealth to obtain, carried great prestige, and created a powerful visual impression on anyone who saw them. He also acquired horses to draw this chariot forward, which served as yet another symbol of prosperity and elevated standing. But the most remarkable element of all was his decision to employ 50 men whose sole responsibility was to sprint ahead of his chariot whenever he made his way through the city streets. Picture in your imagination what this scene must have looked like. Absalom, with his flawless physical features and his spectacular flowing hair, traveling through the streets of Jerusalem seated in a chariot fit for royalty. 50 powerful men racing in front of him, proclaiming his arrival to everyone nearby, making certain the path ahead was clear, ensuring that every person in sight stopped whatever they were doing and turned to watch. This was a performance, a meticulously crafted spectacle intended to leave an impression on ordinary citizens and to plant a particular thought deep within their minds. This man has the appearance of someone who should be king. This man conducts himself the way a king would. Not a single other prince anywhere in Israel traveled in this fashion. Absalom was intentionally distinguishing himself from everyone else, raising himself above his brothers in status, presenting himself as something far greater than merely one among the many sons David had fathered. Every time he appeared in public, he was communicating a powerful message. The chariot declared to everyone watching that he possessed power. The horses announced to all observers that he commanded great wealth. The 50 men running before him proclaimed that his importance was so great that men would serve at his command. But this elaborate display was not merely an exercise in vanity and showing off. It marked the opening phase of a campaign for political power, though nobody at the time understood it for what it truly was. Absalom was constructing a public image of himself, shaping the impressions people formed, causing citizens to mentally connect him with the authority and power that belonged to kings. His desire was for the residents of Jerusalem and travelers arriving from every tribe throughout Israel to observe him and immediately think of kingship. But the campaign Absalom was waging did not rely solely on outward appearances and spectacle. He possessed a far more direct and intimate strategy for capturing the loyalty of the common people. The second book of Samuel at chapter 15 and verse 2 describes the routine he followed each and every day. Absalom developed the habit of rising from sleep early in the morning and positioning himself right beside the road leading to the city gate. Whenever any person arrived who had a disagreement that needed to be brought before the king for a ruling, Absalom would call out to that individual and inquire about which city they had traveled from. And when the person replied that they served as a citizen of this or that particular tribe within Israel, Absalom would engage them further. Absalom made certain to station himself at the city gate every single morning without fail. In the culture of ancient Israel, the gate represented far more than simply a way to enter the city walls. It functioned as the hub of all public activity and interaction. This location served as the place where commercial transactions took place, where legal disagreements received hearings, where people congregated to converse and share the latest news with one another. It was the destination anyone would seek out if they needed to present a case before the king and receive his judgment on a matter. And Absalom took care to arrive there earlier than anyone else, intercepting people before they ever had the chance to reach David. The manner in which he approached people was warm and personable and friendly. Whenever someone drew near carrying a legal grievance they wished to address, Absalom would speak out to them, would ask about the city they called home, would draw them into friendly conversation. He did not maintain the coldness or the formal distance that most members of royalty kept. He interacted with these ordinary people as though they truly mattered to him, as though the difficulties they faced held genuine importance to him on a personal level. He committed to memory their names, the towns where they resided, the tribes to which they belonged. He caused each person to feel noticed and acknowledged, then followed the essential part of the strategy he had devised, which is preserved in verse 3. Absalom would speak to the person and declare that clearly their claims possessed merit and justice was on their side, but unfortunately the king had failed to appoint anyone with the authority to give them a proper hearing. This approach demonstrated manipulation of the highest order. Absalom would give ear to whatever legal dispute someone brought to him and would instantly confirm their position as correct. He would assure them that they were absolutely in the right about the matter. He would tell them their case had genuine strength behind it. He would promise them that they had every right to expect justice to be served. But immediately after this, Absalom would introduce seeds of doubt regarding how David ran his government. He would hint that the king had not taken proper care in organizing the system through which justice was administered. He would suggest that David had neglected to place enough judges in positions throughout the various regions of the kingdom, that ordinary people were forced to make the long journey all the way to Jerusalem simply to have their disputes resolved. He never launched direct attacks against David personally, but he was quietly and steadily eroding the confidence people had in how the king governed. And then arrived the final masterful touch, also contained in verse 3. Following his critique, Absalom would express his wish that someone would place him in a position to judge matters throughout the land, because then every single person carrying a dispute or a grievance could come directly to him, and he would make certain they received the justice they deserved. After creating doubt in people's minds about the system David had established, Absalom put himself forward as the answer to every problem. If only he were the one holding authority, if only he possessed the power to act, then not a single person would be denied justice. The approach Absalom employed extended beyond mere words and promises. He grasped the truth that people react not only to the things you tell them, but also to the feelings you create within them. The second book of Samuel at chapter 15 and verse 5 describes another vital component of how he conducted himself. Whenever any person drew near with the intention of showing proper respect toward him, Absalom would extend his hand and take hold of that person and place a kiss upon them. When someone approached Absalom at his position by the gate, the natural response would be to bow down or demonstrate respect in some visible way, since he held the status of a prince. This was the expected and proper behavior according to custom, but Absalom refused to allow it to happen. Instead of accepting their deference, he would stretch out his hand, draw the person up from their bow, or pull them close to himself, and give them a kiss of greeting. This physical act of reaching out shattered the normal boundaries that existed between members of the royal family and ordinary citizens. It communicated to them that he did not consider himself superior to them. It suggested that he was just like them. It implied that they stood on equal footing with one another. This was humility that was not genuine, but it produced remarkably powerful results. People had no experience being treated in this manner by someone of royal blood. Their expectations were for distance to be maintained, for formal protocols to be observed, for the social hierarchy to be respected. But here stood a prince, the most physically attractive man in the entire nation of Israel, traveling in a chariot with 50 men running ahead of him. And yet this same prince would reach out his arms and embrace them as though they were dear friends. This created a profound emotional bond between them. People came away feeling exceptional. They came away feeling that they mattered. They came away feeling that Absalom harbored genuine concern for them as unique individuals, and Absalom maintained this behavior with perfect consistency over time. Verse 5 tells us that whenever any person approached him, he would respond in exactly this way, not just occasionally, not just when dealing with people of significance, but with absolutely everyone who came near. Whether they were prosperous or struggling, whether they hailed from influential tribes or from small obscure villages, every single individual who came before Absalom received identical treatment from him. He caused each and every one of them to feel important, to feel that their voice had been heard, to feel genuinely valued. The outcome of this extended campaign is recorded in verse 6, explaining that Absalom behaved in this manner toward all the people of Israel who traveled to bring matters before the king for his judgment, and through this behavior, Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Pay close attention to that particular word describing what he did. He stole those hearts. The hearts of the people were not offered willingly as gifts. They were taken through deception and trickery. Absalom was carrying out an elaborate deception, manipulating the emotions of everyone he encountered, constructing loyalty toward himself through false presentations of who he really was. But the people who encountered him had no awareness of this truth. They accepted the performance Absalom put on as completely authentic. They were convinced that his words and actions were sincere and genuine. They compared what they saw in him against David, the aging king who remained inside the walls of his palace, while this youthful and energetic prince stationed himself at the gate every single morning, giving ear to their troubles, confirming that their concerns had merit, making promises that they would receive justice. Within their thoughts, Absalom represented what was to come. After investing years in this meticulous work of building political support, Absalom had reached the point where he was prepared to take decisive action. But executing his plan required him to be somewhere other than Jerusalem, somewhere beyond the reach of David's direct authority, in a location where he could assemble those who supported him and stake his claim to the royal throne. The second book of Samuel at chapter 15 and verse 7 reveals the plan he had devised. When a period of 4 years had come to an end, Absalom approached the king and requested permission to travel so that he could fulfill a sacred promise that he had made to the Lord while in the city of Hebron 4 complete years. That was the length of time Absalom had devoted to positioning himself at the gate, constructing his foundation of popular support, capturing the hearts of people throughout Israel. The moment to act had finally arrived, but he could not simply stand up and proclaim himself king while still inside the walls of Jerusalem. His first requirement was to depart from the city so that he could assemble his forces and build the momentum his plan demanded. So he came before David offering a justification rooted in religious duty. Absalom explained to his father that he had entered into a vow with the Lord and that fulfilling this sacred promise required him to journey to Hebron. Verse 8 contains the reasoning he provided to support his request. He asserted that during the 3 years he had spent living in exile in Geshur, he had made a solemn promise to God that if he were ever permitted to return to the land of Israel, he would travel to Hebron to offer worship and complete the fulfillment of this vow. The explanation he offered appeared entirely reasonable and proper. Hebron held tremendous significance in the history of Israel as a nation. This was the place where Abraham had made his dwelling and the location where his body was laid to rest. This was the very city where David himself had first received his crown as king over the tribe of Judah, before eventually ascending to rule over the entirety of Israel. David harbored no suspicion about what was really happening. Verse 9 preserves how he responded to his son's request. After Absalom rose to his feet and set out on his journey to Hebron, David offered his blessing and granted permission for Absalom to depart. The king had absolutely no awareness that he was sending his own son away to launch an armed uprising against him, but every word Absalom had spoken was a lie. No such vow had ever been made, or if some vow did exist, it was certainly not the true purpose driving this journey. Absalom had selected Hebron with great deliberation, based on careful strategic thinking. The first consideration was that this city had served as David's original seat of power, which would provide Absalom's claim to rule with a sense of historical rightness and legitimacy. The second consideration was that Hebron lay far enough distant from Jerusalem to provide Absalom with sufficient time to organize his rebellion before David could mount any kind of response. Absalom did not make the journey to Hebron by himself, with no companions. Verse 11 tells us that traveling alongside Absalom were 200 men from the city of Jerusalem who had received invitations to attend, and these men made the journey without any knowledge of the true purpose, completely innocent of what was being planned. Absalom had brought 200 men from Jerusalem as part of his traveling party, but none of these individuals had any understanding of what was actually taking place. Their belief was that they were going to participate in a ceremony of religious observance. The moment Absalom arrived in Hebron, he set into motion the conspiracy that he had spent years carefully constructing. The second book of Samuel, at chapter 15 and verse 10, exposes the signal that he had prepared in advance. Absalom had dispatched secret messengers to travel throughout every single tribe of Israel, carrying identical instructions that told people to listen for the sound of the trumpet, and the instant they heard it, they should make the proclamation that Absalom had become king in the city of Hebron. This passage reveals to us just how meticulously Absalom had organized this rebellion against his father. His activities had not been limited to winning over hearts and minds only within Jerusalem's walls. He had been sending messengers in secret throughout all 12 of the tribes that comprised Israel, establishing a web of supporters scattered across every region of the land. These were individuals who had encountered him at his position by the gate, who had been struck with admiration by his magnificent chariot and by the concern he expressed for justice, who had become convinced that he would govern as a superior king compared to David. Absalom had provided every one of them with the exact same instruction, telling them to wait and listen for the blast of the trumpet, and then immediately declare that Absalom had assumed the kingship. The choice to use a trumpet as the signal demonstrated brilliant planning. Throughout ancient Israel, trumpets served to announce events of major importance, including the commencement of religious festivals, the summoning of people to formal gatherings, and the crowning of new kings. When the population scattered throughout Israel heard the sound of trumpets ringing out in their towns and villages, they would recognize instantly that something of great significance was occurring, and every supporter of Absalom would begin proclaiming him as king without delay, generating a wave of declarations that would sweep across the entire nation at the same moment. This was not some spontaneous eruption of popular discontent. This was a meticulously coordinated attempt to seize control of the entire nation. Absalom had positioned supporters within every single tribe, all of them waiting for his signal, every one of them prepared to act the very instant the trumpet sound reached their ears. The rebellion would not remain confined to a single location. It would explode into existence everywhere across the land at exactly the same time. But Absalom had also succeeded in obtaining an ally of crucial importance to his plans. Verse 12 informs us that while Absalom was in the midst of presenting his sacrificial offerings, he sent a summons for Ahithophel the Gilonite, the man who served as David's counselor and who came from his hometown of Gilo. Ahithophel was not merely some ordinary person who had chosen to support the rebellion. This man served as David's personal advisor, one of the individuals the king trusted most deeply, the person who had helped David work through difficult decisions, who possessed intimate knowledge of the king's methods of thinking and strategic weaknesses. This very man had turned his back on the king and joined the other side. The verse goes on to say that the conspiracy gained strength and power, and the number of people rallying to Absalom's side continued to grow larger and larger. The moment the rebellion became public knowledge, people rushed to align themselves with Absalom. All the momentum and energy flowed entirely in Absalom's direction. Word of what was happening struck Jerusalem with the force of lightning from the sky. The second book of Samuel at chapter 15 and verse 13 preserves the moment when David first learned what was unfolding, describing how a messenger arrived before David and delivered the news that the hearts belonging to the men of Israel had turned away and now followed after Absalom. With those words hanging in the air, David's entire world came crashing down around him. His son had not traveled to Hebron for the purpose of worshipping God. He had gone there to steal the throne out from under his father. The way David responded was immediate, and it was shocking in its nature. Verse 14 contains the orders he issued, where David instructed every servant who remained with him in Jerusalem to rise up and prepare to flee, warning that if they did not escape, there would be no possibility of getting away from Absalom. He urged them to move with speed, warning that otherwise Absalom would overtake them rapidly and would bring destruction crashing down upon them and would put the entire city to the sword. David, the same warrior king who had brought down the giant Goliath, who had crushed the armies of the Philistines in battle after battle, this same David made the choice to run away. He made no attempt to gather the fighting men of his army. He made no effort to strengthen the fortifications defending Jerusalem. What he commanded instead was that everyone evacuate the city immediately without delay. The messenger had informed him that the hearts of the men throughout Israel had turned to follow after Absalom. David grasped the full meaning of what these words conveyed. His own son had managed to turn the entire nation against their king. Verse 15 demonstrates that the servants of David kept their loyalty intact and spoke to the king, declaring that his servants stood ready to carry out whatever their lord the king determined to do. They pledged themselves to remain at his side regardless of what path he chose to follow. And so the evacuation of the city commenced. The second book of Samuel at chapter 15 and verse 16 describes the departure that followed. The king went forth from the city with his entire household following behind him, and the king left behind 10 of his concubines to look after and maintain the palace. David walked out through the doors of the palace where he had ruled, leaving behind the city over which he had reigned for so many years. Every member of his household came after him, including his wives, his children, and all who served him. But he left 10 of the women who served as his concubines behind, so that someone would remain to care for the royal residence. Verse 17 continues the account, explaining that the king departed and the entire group of people loyal to him came after him, and they came to a stop at the final house before the open land began. David and those who remained faithful to him exited Jerusalem and paused at the boundary of the city, at the last dwelling standing before the countryside stretched out ahead. There David waited to observe who would choose to accompany him in his flight. Verse 18 says that all of his servants passed before him in procession, along with all of the Cherethites and all of the Pelethites, and all 600 of the Gittites who had been following him ever since he departed from Gath. And all of these men passed by and positioned themselves ahead of the king. The soldiers who served as David's personal guard, the mercenaries from foreign lands who fought for him, the warriors who had followed him through years of battle, these men remained at his side. They marched past him in their military formation, demonstrating through their presence that their loyalty had not wavered, even as the rest of the nation shifted its allegiance to Absalom. This moment represented the darkest hour David had ever experienced. His very own son had stolen away his throne. The people over whom he had ruled for so long had turned their backs on him and walked away. He was running away from the capital city that had been his home, uncertain of where his path would lead or how this terrible chapter would reach its conclusion. When Absalom made his entrance into Jerusalem following David's flight from the city, he recognized that he needed to take some action that would make any future reconciliation with his father completely impossible. He needed to destroy every possibility of retreat, to make a public declaration so deeply offensive that there would be no path leading back to the way things had been. So Absalom sought out Ahithophel to receive guidance on how he might make his position as the new ruler absolutely secure. The second book of Samuel at chapter 16 and verse 20 describes what transpired next. Absalom addressed Ahithophel and asked him to provide his counsel, asking what course of action they should follow. Absalom was seeking strategic direction from his advisor about the best method to make his claim to the throne unshakable and permanent. Verse 21 preserves the counsel that Ahithophel provided to him. Ahithophel spoke to Absalom and told him to go in and lie with the concubines belonging to his father, the women David had left behind to maintain the palace. And when all of Israel heard that Absalom had made himself utterly detestable in the eyes of his father, the resolve of everyone who supported him would be strengthened and made firm. This guidance went far beyond mere political strategy. It constituted a deliberate act representing the ultimate form of disrespect that could be shown. By taking possession of the concubines who belonged to his father, Absalom would be asserting his ownership over everything that had ever been David's property. Within the customs of ancient culture, claiming a king's women was equivalent to claiming the throne he sat upon. The scheme Ahithophel proposed served two distinct purposes. The first was to strengthen the resolve of those supporting Absalom by demonstrating to them that any possibility of making peace with David had been eliminated forever. The second was to announce publicly to the entire nation that Absalom had assumed the position of king. Verse 22 describes the events that followed this council. A tent was erected for Absalom upon the rooftop of the palace, and Absalom went in and lay with the concubines belonging to his father, where all of Israel could witness what was happening. They constructed a tent upon the roof of the royal palace, the same rooftop, the exact same rooftop where David had first spotted Bathsheba bathing, where his own sin began. Now, on that identical roof, his son was completing the cycle of judgment. What David did in secret, Absalom did in the sight of all Israel. The phrase stating that this occurred where all of Israel could see carries tremendous significance. This was not something done in secret behind closed doors. This was a spectacle performed for public consumption, intended to be observed and understood by every person in the land. Absalom desired that the entire population of Israel should bear witness to this act, that everyone should comprehend he had completely and utterly rejected his father. This brought to fulfillment a prophecy that the prophet Nathan had delivered to David many years before, when David had committed his sin with Bathsheba and arranged for the murder of her husband Uriah. The prophet had spoken these words recorded in the second book of Samuel at chapter 12 and verse 11, declaring that the Lord would cause evil to rise up against David from within his own household, and that the Lord would take his wives right before his eyes and hand them over to another man close to him, and that this man would lie with David's wives beneath the open sun where everyone could see. What Absalom carried out upon that rooftop represented the fulfillment of the judgment God had pronounced upon David for his past transgressions. After establishing his position through this shameful and degrading act, Absalom needed to determine what his following move should be. David had escaped from Jerusalem by fleeing the city, but he remained alive and still commanded followers who had stayed loyal to him. Ahithophel understood that the essential factor in winning this armed uprising was taking swift and decisive action without any delay. What Ahithophel said next could have ended everything. If Absalom had listened, David would have died that very night. But one voice would change the course of history. The second book of Samuel at chapter 17 and verse 1 preserves the military approach that Ahithophel recommended. In addition to his earlier counsel, Ahithophel addressed Absalom and requested permission to personally select 12,000 soldiers, saying he would rise up and go after David that very same night. Ahithophel was insistent on taking action without waiting. He sought authorization to handpick 12,000 fighting men and pursue David before the night was over. Verse 2 lays out the logic behind his thinking, explaining that he would fall upon David while he was exhausted and his spirits were broken, and would throw him into a state of terror, and every person traveling with David would scatter and run away, and Ahithophel would cut down only the king himself and no one else. The strategy Ahithophel put forward demonstrated brilliant thinking in how straightforward it was. David, along with everyone following him, had only just departed from Jerusalem in their escape. Their bodies would be fatigued, their emotions would be spent, and they would not be anticipating an attack coming so quickly. Launching a surprise assault under cover of darkness would generate confusion and terror among their ranks. The critical element of his proposal was the declaration that only the king would be struck down. Ahithophel was not suggesting that they slaughter everyone. His intention was to end the life of David and David alone. Taking this action would bring the entire conflict to an immediate conclusion. With David no longer living, there would exist no competing claim to the throne of Israel. Verse 3 continues presenting the argument Ahithophel made, promising that he would bring the entirety of the people back to serve Absalom, just as a new bride returns home to live with her husband, explaining that they were seeking to take the life of just one individual. And once that was accomplished, all the people throughout the land would live in peace. Ahithophel gave his assurance that ending David's life would bring the entire nation together under the rule of Absalom. Peace would be established because the struggle would reach its conclusion rapidly, and very little blood would need to be spilled. The closing sentence of verse 3 tells us that the counsel Ahithophel offered appeared sound and correct to Absalom and to every one of the elders throughout Israel. Everyone present expressed their agreement that this was an excellent plan. Absalom found it pleasing. Those who advised him gave their approval to it. Had this strategy been put into action, David would almost certainly have lost his life that very night, and Absalom would have secured his grip on the throne permanently without any further challenge. Before the plan that Ahithophel proposed could be carried out, another voice made itself heard in the discussion, the voice of Hushai. This man from the region of Arki had served as David's companion and advisor, but when David fled the city of Jerusalem, he sent Hushai back inside the walls with very specific instructions to follow. David told Hushai to pretend that he had switched his allegiance to Absalom and to argue against whatever counsel Ahithophel might offer at any opportunity that presented itself. The second book of Samuel at chapter 17 and verse 5 reveals what occurred next, describing how Absalom gave the order to summon Hushai the Archite as well, and to hear what thoughts he might contribute to the discussion. Before reaching a final decision to proceed with the strategy Ahithophel had laid out, Absalom made the choice to seek another perspective on the matter. Verse 6 records what took place when Hushai arrived, explaining that when Hushai came before Absalom, Absalom described to him what Ahithophel had proposed and asked whether they should follow through with his recommendation, or whether Hushai had different counsel to offer. Absalom outlined the entirety of Ahithophel's strategy for Hushai and inquired whether they ought to proceed according to his suggestions. Hushai recognized that he needed to undermine the credibility of what Ahithophel had proposed. Verse 7 tells us that Hushai responded to Absalom by declaring that on this particular occasion, the advice that Ahithophel had provided was not sound. This represented a daring statement to make openly. Ahithophel had earned a reputation throughout the land for the quality of his wisdom and insight. Verse 8 preserves the reasoning Hushai offered to support his position, where he told Absalom that he surely knew that his father and the men who fought alongside him were warriors of great might, and that their current state of mind was like that of a mother bear in the wilderness, whose cubs have been stolen from her. Furthermore, Hushai pointed out that David possessed extensive experience in matters of warfare, and that he would certainly not spend the night resting among the common soldiers. Hushai constructed an image of David as a fighter of tremendous danger and extensive experience. He drew a comparison between David's men and a female bear from whom someone had taken her young offspring, which was considered the most perilous creature anyone could possibly encounter. Verse 9 carries his argument forward, suggesting that even at that very moment, David had concealed himself in some pit in the ground or in some other hiding place, and the moment some of Absalom's men fell during the opening clash, anyone who heard about it would begin saying that a massacre had occurred among those fighting for Absalom. Hushai was planting the idea that David would position his forces in a hidden location and launch an ambush against them. Then Hushai made his appeal to the fear that lived within those listening. Verse 10 continues his argument, claiming that even the most courageous soldier, a man whose heart burned with the fierceness of a lion, would completely lose his nerve and be filled with terror, because every person in Israel was aware that David was a warrior of tremendous ability and that the men who remained at his side were fighters of proven valor. Even the bravest soldiers in Absalom's forces would feel their courage drain away if word reached them that David was mounting a successful resistance. After dismantling the strategy that Ahithophel had put forward, Hushai presented his own alternative approach in verse 11, recommending that the entire fighting force of Israel be assembled under Absalom's command, gathering men from the territory of Dan all the way to Beersheba, until their numbers were as countless as grains of sand along the seashore, and that Absalom himself should ride out to lead them personally into battle. Rather than mounting a rapid assault with a force of 12,000 soldiers, Hushai was proposing that they take the time to gather every man in Israel capable of fighting. Verse 12 extends his proposal further, promising that in this way they would descend upon David wherever he happened to be located, and they would fall upon him the way morning dew settles upon the ground. And when they finished, neither David himself nor a single one of the men fighting beside him would remain alive. Hushai made promises of complete and total victory over their enemies. The outcome of this discussion is preserved in verse 14, which states that Absalom, along with every man of Israel present, declared that the counsel offered by Hushai the Archite was superior to the counsel that Ahithophel had provided, because the Lord had determined that the sound advice of Ahithophel should be rejected, so that the Lord could bring destruction down upon Absalom. Absalom reached the decision to follow the plan that Hushai had outlined. The scripture makes absolutely clear that this was not merely the result of human deliberation and decision-making. God himself was actively working to ensure that the counsel of Ahithophel would be defeated. The postponement that resulted from following the advice Hushai gave provided David with time that proved absolutely essential to his survival. He managed to cross over the Jordan River to the other side, assembled his fighting forces around him, and organized them into a proper army ready for battle. While this was happening, Absalom was gathering together every fighting man throughout Israel and making preparations for the coming conflict. The second book of Samuel at chapter 18 and verse 6 identifies the location where the two armies met in combat, stating that the army marched out into open territory to face the forces of Israel, and the fighting took place within the forest region of Ephraim. This was not a flat open expanse of the type where large armies typically engaged one another in battle. This was woodland, densely packed with trees, terrain that was difficult to navigate and fight in. Before the fighting commenced, David issued specific orders to the men who commanded his forces. Verse 5 preserves the command he gave, showing how the king instructed Joab, along with Abishai and Ittai, to treat the young man Absalom with gentleness for his sake. And all of the soldiers heard when the king delivered these orders concerning Absalom to every one of his commanders. David spoke directly to the 3 military leaders who held the highest positions under him and told them that Absalom must be handled gently. Despite the fact that his own son had committed treason against him, David continued to love him deeply and desperately wanted his life to be preserved. The battle itself resulted in devastating losses for the army that followed Absalom. Verse 7 describes what the outcome looked like, stating that the fighting men of Israel suffered defeat there at the hands of those who served David, and the killing that occurred on that day was enormous in its scale, with 20,000 men losing their lives. 20,000 soldiers fighting for Absalom perished during that single engagement. But what caused the deaths of most of these men was not the soldiers fighting for David, it was the forest itself that claimed their lives. Verse 8 provides the explanation, stating that the fighting spread across the entire expanse of the countryside, and the forest consumed more lives on that day than the weapons of war did. The challenging and treacherous terrain of the woodland killed a greater number of men than the actual combat between the two armies. Soldiers became disoriented and lost their way, tumbled into holes and ravines, became cut off and separated from the units they belonged to. As the fighting continued to rage and the army following Absalom crumbled and fell apart all around him, the prince who had started this rebellion attempted to make his escape from the battlefield. But his effort to get away resulted in one of the most extraordinary deaths that has ever been preserved in the sacred writings. The second book of Samuel at chapter 18 and verse 9 describes the events that unfolded, telling how Absalom unexpectedly encountered some of the men who served David, and at that moment Absalom was mounted upon his mule, and as the animal carried him forward, it passed beneath the dense branches of an enormous oak tree, and his head became trapped firmly within the oak, and he remained suspended in the space between the sky above and the ground below, while the mule he had been sitting upon continued walking and left him behind. Absalom was traveling on the back of his mule when he rode directly beneath a large oak tree that grew along his path. The branches of this tree hung thick and low to the ground. As he passed beneath them, his head became wedged and stuck fast among the branches. According to some traditional accounts, it was his famous and magnificent hair that became entangled and wrapped around the branches above him. Other interpretations suggest that his head simply passed between branches that then closed tightly around his neck and held him fast. The mule beneath him continued on its way without stopping, and Absalom was left dangling from the tree with no way down. The phrase describing him as suspended between heaven and earth carries tremendous power and meaning. Picture this moment, the most beautiful man in Israel, the prince who rode through Jerusalem with 50 men running before him, the rebel who stole a kingdom, now hanging helpless from a tree, his famous hair tangled in the branches, his feet kicking at empty air, his hands clawing at nothing. The same beauty that made him legendary had become the trap that killed him. He hung there, between heaven and earth, belonging to neither. This was the very same man who had appeared to be royalty itself as he rode through the streets of Jerusalem, the same prince whose flawless physical appearance had caused every eye to turn and stare at him in wonder. Now that very beauty which had distinguished him had transformed into a snare that caught him. The very qualities that had caused him to stand out from everyone else had now led directly to his capture and his doom. One of the soldiers fighting for David caught sight of Absalom as he hung there from the tree. Verse 10 informs us that a certain man witnessed what had happened and went to Joab with a report, telling him to look, because he had seen Absalom hanging suspended in an oak tree. The soldier delivered this account of what he had witnessed directly to Joab. The response that Joab gave, which is preserved in verse 11, reveals the frustration and disbelief he felt. Joab demanded to know from the man who had brought him this news how it was possible that he had actually seen Absalom there, and then asked why he had not struck him down and put him in the ground right where he hung, and declared that he would have been pleased to reward him with 10 pieces of silver along with a belt. Joab found it impossible to believe that this soldier had failed to kill Absalom when such a perfect opportunity had presented itself. But the soldier would not comply with what Joab was suggesting, and his reasoning is preserved in verse 12. The man responded to Joab by saying that even if he could feel the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver resting in his palm, he would never have lifted his hand to harm the son of the king, because all of them had heard with their own ears when the king issued his command to Joab, and to Abishai and to Ittai, ordering them for his sake to keep the young man Absalom safe from harm. The soldier brought to Joab's attention that David had given a public order to his officers, commanding them to handle Absalom with care and gentleness. Joab had no tolerance for such hesitation and restraint. Verse 14 preserves how he responded to the soldier. Joab declared that he refused to stand there wasting precious time in this manner with him any longer. And then he grabbed 3 javelins and gripped them in his hand and drove them deep into the heart of Absalom, while he remained alive and still hanging from the oak tree. Joab seized 3 javelins and plunged them into the chest of Absalom as he dangled there from the branches, completely unable to defend himself. This action stood in direct violation of the command that David had given. The king had specifically instructed his commanders to handle Absalom gently and to ensure that his life was preserved. But Joab arrived at a decision on the field of battle that the emotional bond David felt toward his son could not be permitted to override what military strategy demanded. Joab was fully aware that Absalom would continue to pose a danger as long as breath remained in his body. Even if they managed to take him prisoner, those who supported Absalom might organize an attempt to set him free. When viewed from a perspective that considered only strategy and practical outcomes, there was no choice but for Absalom to die. So Joab ended his life, even though he knew with complete certainty that he was defying the explicit orders his king had given him. But Joab did not complete the killing by himself, and without assistance. The second book of Samuel at chapter 18 and verse 15 reveals that 10 young soldiers who served as armor-bearers for Joab formed a circle around Absalom and struck him repeatedly until he was dead. After Joab had wounded Absalom with his 3 javelins, 10 of the soldiers who served under Joab personally surrounded the prince as he lay dying and completed the act of killing him. With the death of Absalom, the purpose that had driven the battle came to an end. Verse 16 states that Joab raised the trumpet to his lips and blew, and the soldiers who had been chasing the forces of Israel turned back from their pursuit, because Joab held them back and prevented them from continuing. Joab brought the fighting to an immediate halt the moment Absalom drew his last breath. But a decision still needed to be made regarding what should be done with the body of Absalom. Verse 17 describes the manner in which he was laid to rest. They picked up the body of Absalom and threw it down into a large pit that had been dug in the forest, and then they heaped an enormous pile of stones on top of it, and every man of Israel who had been fighting scattered and fled back to their own homes. They cast the body of Absalom into a hole in the ground and covered it over with a mound of stones. This did not constitute an honorable burial befitting a prince of royal blood. This was the burial reserved for criminals who had committed great offenses. David remained in the city called Mahanaim, waiting anxiously to receive word about how the battle had gone. He had no knowledge of whether his army had achieved victory or suffered defeat. And above all other concerns, he did not know whether his son Absalom still lived or had been killed. The second book of Samuel at chapter 18 and verse 24 tells us that David was seated in the space between the two gates of the city, and the watchman who kept vigil climbed up to the roof of the gate alongside the wall, and when he raised his eyes and looked out into the distance, he spotted a man running toward the city all by himself. A watchman standing guard upon the wall caught sight of a single runner making his way toward them. Verse 25 continues the account, explaining that the watchman called down and reported what he had seen to the king, and the king responded by saying that if this man was running alone with no others accompanying him, he must be carrying news to deliver. And the runner continued to move swiftly and drew closer and closer to where they waited. A runner approaching alone typically indicated that news was being delivered. Ahimaaz was the first to reach the city and called out his message as recorded in verse 28, crying aloud to the king that everything was favorable, and then he lowered himself before the king until his face touched the ground and declared that the Lord his God deserved blessing and praise, for he had handed over the men who had lifted their hands in violence against his lord the king. Ahimaaz proclaimed that victory had been achieved, but the response that David gave, which is preserved in verse 29, reveals what truly occupied his thoughts and his heart. The king asked only one thing, whether the young man named Absalom was safe and well. Ahimaaz replied that at the moment when Joab dispatched him along with another servant of the king, he had witnessed some kind of great disturbance, but he did not have knowledge of what had actually taken place. David expressed no interest in hearing about the battle or its outcome. The only question he wanted answered concerned Absalom and nothing else. Then the second messenger completed his journey and arrived. The second book of Samuel at chapter 18 and verse 31 tells us that the Cushite appeared, and when he reached David, he declared that he brought favorable tidings for his lord the king, for the Lord had rescued him on this day from the power of every person who had risen in opposition against him. But once again, the only question David posed, which is recorded in verse 32, focused entirely on his son. The king asked the Cushite directly whether the young man Absalom was safe and unharmed. The Cushite provided his answer by expressing the wish that every enemy of his lord the king and every person who rises up intending to bring evil upon him might share the same fate as that young man had experienced. The Cushite never stated in plain words that Absalom had been killed, but David grasped the meaning behind what he said. The second book of Samuel at chapter 18 and verse 33 describes how David responded to this news. The king was shaken to the very depths of his being and climbed up to the room situated above the gate and collapsed into weeping. And as he made his way there, he cried out these words, calling for his son Absalom, repeating the words "my son" over and over, crying out for Absalom again, expressing his wish that he himself had died in place of his child, calling out once more for Absalom, for his son, for his son. The mighty warrior who killed Goliath collapsed like a child. The king who conquered nations crumbled on the floor. He had won the battle and lost everything that mattered. My son, my son, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Over and over. The same words, the same name, a father's heart shattering into pieces that would never fit back together. He expressed his desire to have given his own life so that Absalom might have lived. The victory that had been won held no meaning or value for him whatsoever. The account of Absalom reaches its conclusion with a detail that exposes the hollowness that lay beneath all of his ambitious striving. The second book of Samuel at chapter 18 and verse 18 reveals something that Absalom had done during the years when he still drew breath. During his lifetime, Absalom had commissioned and erected a pillar for himself, placing it in the valley belonging to the king. His reason for doing this, which he explained himself, was that he possessed no son who would preserve the memory of his name for future generations. He gave the pillar his own name, and from that day forward, people have called it the Monument of Absalom. Absalom had constructed a memorial in his own honor while he was still living. He put up a stone pillar in the royal valley situated near the city of Jerusalem. He provided his own explanation for why he did this, stating that no son existed to keep his name alive in the memories of those who came after him. This statement raises interesting questions because the second book of Samuel at chapter 14 and verse 27 tells us that Absalom fathered 3 sons and also a daughter whom he named Tamar in honor of his sister. Absalom had indeed been the father of 3 sons during his life. Yet when he built this monument to himself, he claimed that he had no son at all. This can only mean that by the time Absalom erected this pillar, every one of his 3 sons had already passed away. This held tremendous significance within the culture of ancient Israel. The legacy of a man continued to exist through the sons he left behind him. Without a son to carry on your name, all memory of you would eventually fade and disappear. So Absalom constructed a pillar made of stone and attached his own name to it. He built a monument because he had no son to remember him. He stole a throne he could not keep. He died reaching for a crown he would never wear. The man who had everything ended with nothing but stone. The irony contained in this act is deeply painful to consider. Absalom had launched his rebellion with the goal of seizing the throne and establishing a dynasty of his own, but no sons remained alive to inherit what he fought for. He was waging war to claim a throne that he could not hand down to anyone after him. Every bit of his ambition was destined to amount to nothing in the end. The monument continued to stand there in that place, serving as a reminder of what had happened. People referred to it as the Monument of Absalom, exactly as he had intended when he named it. But rather than serving as a celebration of how great he had been, it transformed into evidence of his ultimate failure. The stunning prince who seemed to possess everything ended his life with nothing at all remaining. No throne beneath him, no dynasty to follow him, no son left alive to hold his memory. Nothing remained but a pillar carved from stone and a heap of rocks piled over his shameful burial place. If this account of treachery, divine judgment, and heartbreaking tragedy has stirred something within you, do not keep it hidden inside yourself. Press the subscribe button to become part of our community as we continue examining the compelling narratives found in Scripture that shaped the course of history and revealed how God works within the affairs of human beings. Pass this video along to someone in your life who needs to understand how ambition that lacks wisdom inevitably leads to destruction, and how the effects of sinful choices ripple outward through generation after generation. This story carries one lesson that changes everything. Absalom had beauty, intelligence, patience, and ambition. He had everything except the one thing that truly mattered: someone to carry his legacy forward. If this story hit you, drop one word in the comments: legacy. And if you want to see how ambition destroyed another of David's sons, that story is waiting for you right here. Until next time, remember this: true greatness is not measured by the chariots we ride or the crowds that follow us. It is measured only by what we leave in the hearts of those who truly knew us.